The heavy lead crystal tumbler on the mahogany desk did not rattle. It shattered into powdered dust before the sound of the suppressed rifle crack even reached the study. A second round tore through the 10-year-old cedar wainscoting, striking Murphy Moretti precisely 2 inches below his left ribs. The impact spun the undisputed sovereign of New England's underworld out of his leather chair and slammed his body hard against the cold Italian marble floor. Blood, thick, dark, and arterial, pooled instantly beneath his pressed linen shirt. In the suffocating dark of the Newport estate, the backup generators did not hum to life. The 17 perimeter floodlights remained dead. The emergency sirens had been surgically lobotomized from inside the house's master security terminal at exactly 11:31 p.m. Through the shattered terrace French doors, the deafening crunch of tactical boots on gravel signaled the arrival of an unsanctioned extermination squad. They moved with the effortless familiarity of men who held blueprints drawn by someone living under this very roof. Murphy reached for the customized Sig Sauer beneath his armpit, his vision tunneling into gray static. His fingers brushed the cold steel, but his motor functions collapsed as hypovolemic shock claimed his nervous system. Then, from beneath the immense shadow of the knee-hole desk, 150 pounds of trained apex predator moved without a sound. Bruno did not bark. In 7 brutal years at Murphy Moretti's side, the Caucasian Shepherd Mastiff mix had never once wasted breath on a warning growl when violence was already present. The massive beast clamped his jaws into the thick collar of Murphy's heavy wool overcoat, planting 4 massive claw-scarred paws against the slippery polished stone. The war dog dragged his 6'2" master 13 feet backward across the hall. He hauled him behind the solid 18-inch reinforced granite archway of the central rotunda, the only blind spot in the entire grand hall immune to exterior sniper fire. Then Bruno stepped over Murphy's chest. He planted his front paws squarely on either side of the Mafia boss's bleeding torso. He lowered his center of gravity, his amber eyes reflecting the cold moonlight pouring through broken glass, and transformed himself into an impenetrable wall of living muscle, bone, and fangs. Outside the perimeter, the manor's loyalist counter-assault struck with deafening brutality. Marco Rinaldi had driven through the South Gate in 3 minutes flat, his black SUV ramming the intruder's lead tactical van directly into the stone pillars. Gunfire ripped through the gardens for 6 continuous minutes, until the night returned to a horrifying, hollow silence. 30 armed Moretti enforcers, their rifles still smoking and their faces streaked with soot, rushed into the great rotunda. 4 high-ranking private trauma surgeons, summoned by emergency encrypted frequencies from Providence, ran through the kitchen threshold carrying surgical kits, plasma bags, and portable defibrillators. Yet, 15 feet from where Murphy Moretti lay dying, the entire underworld army came to a dead, terrified halt. Bruno stood over his master. His thick black lips were peeled back over 3-inch canines, exposing gums dripping with white foam. His spine bristled into an unbroken ridge of jagged fur. A subsonic, bone-vibrating vibration resonated deep within his massive chest cavity, a frequency that bypassed the ears and triggered pure primal dread in the pit of every man's stomach. "Bruno, down!" Marco Rinaldi shouted, taking one desperate step forward with his hands raised, sweat stinging his eyes. "It's Marco. Let the doctors through, you stupid beast, or he bleeds out in 5 minutes." Bruno's head dropped 2 inches level with his shoulders. His weight shifted forward by a fraction of an inch. Marco, a man who had tortured cartel hitmen without blinking, froze mid-stride, his boots glued to the stone. He knew with absolute mathematical certainty that if his foot descended another 6 inches, the dog would tear his throat out before his pistol could clear its holster. They brought out a 5-pound jar of raw aged beef from the walk-in cooler, sliding it across the bloody floorboards. The jar stopped 3 feet away. Bruno never even flicked an eye toward the meat. 3 veteran capos took turns reciting the 7 classic Sicilian obedience commands Murphy had used since the animal was a pup. Bruno's ears swiveled to track every syllable, acknowledging the words with chilling intelligence, yet his body remained an immovable blockade over Murphy's fading pulse. Elias Ward, the pale head of a state intelligence, dialed a world-renowned canine behavioral specialist in Boston on speakerphone. "He is in terminal defense lock," the woman's voice crackled through the static of the hallway. "The dog knows the pack alpha was betrayed from within his own perimeter. In his mind, every single human being standing in that room is an active executioner. If you touch him, he will kill until he is shot dead, and your boss will die during the scramble. Do not approach." At 1:38 a.m., Dr. Leonard Voss, Murphy Moretti's personal physician for over 2 decades, pushed his way through the circle of armed men. Voss was impeccably dressed, despite the hour, his silver hair immaculate, carrying a black leather medical satchel. "Stand aside, all of you," Voss commanded with aristocratic coldness, snapping on a pair of blue sterile latex gloves. "I have treated Murphy since he was 19 years old. The animal knows my scent. Get out of my way before the blood loss becomes irreversible." Voss took 3 measured steps into the circle. Then, something occurred that caused 30 hardened criminals to instinctively reach for their sidearms in sheer panic. Bruno did not merely hold his defensive ground. For the first time in 2 agonizing hours, the beast abandoned his stance over Murphy's chest. He lunged forward 2 explosive paces, slamming his massive chest squarely against Dr. Voss's knees, his jaws snapping shut with the sound of a bear trap mere inches from the doctor's jugular. The sheer predatory hatred radiating from the animal was fundamentally different from the stoic guarding he had shown the others. Dr. Voss stumbled violently backward, turning ghost white, his medical bag spilling open across the marble. "The beast has gone completely rabid," Voss shrieked, his voice climbing an octave higher than normal. "Shoot it. Marco, put a bullet in its brain immediately, or Murphy dies on this floor." Glock slides racked back in unison across the hall. Trigger fingers tightened against cold steel. "Nobody fires a single shot," Marco roared, raising both arms. "If a stray bullet ricochets into Murphy, I will personally flay whoever pulled the trigger." The standoff had reached an absolute, lethal stalemate. The wall clock clicked to 1:40 a.m. Murphy's breathing had devolved into shallow, wet, rattling gasps. From the darkened entrance of the service quarters at the far eastern edge of the rotunda, a tiny figure stepped out into the bloody hall. Nobody noticed her at first. Allie Carter, the 26-year-old live-in housekeeper, had spent the last 2 hours locked in her bedroom closet, weeping silently while pressing her hand over her daughter's ears to shield her from the sound of gunfire. But the child had slipped through her trembling fingers when Allie had momentarily buried her face in her apron to pray. 3-year-old Lily walked into the great rotunda completely barefoot. She wore a simple, slightly faded red cotton dress that was crumpled from a half-interrupted sleep. Clutched loosely in her left hand was a one-eared plush teddy bear. Her small, bare feet made soft, rhythmic slapping sounds against the cold marble tiles as she walked past the boots of towering mobsters holding assault rifles. Allie appeared at the hallway archway, her face drained of all color, clapping both hands over her mouth to stifle a scream that would have triggered a slaughter. Marco's heart plummeted straight to his shoes. "Hold your fire," he whispered, his voice shaking with pure horror. "Nobody breathe. Don't make a sound." Lily did not see the pooling blood, the shattered glass, or the grim faces of 30 armed men. She only heard the faint, pitiful whimper vibrating deep in the throat of the giant monster in the center of the room. To everyone else, Bruno was a terrifying weapon of war. To Lily, he was the giant furry shatty that waited by the walk-in pantry every single morning at 5:45 a.m. For the past 6 months, long before the sun crested the Atlantic horizon, and before her mother woke to start the estate's breakfast service, Lily would sneak down the back stairs. She would sit on the kitchen linoleum in her pajamas and share her secret stash of butterscotch candies with the monster who made the entire eastern seaboard tremble. She had wiped his drool with the hem of her sleeve. She had whispered stories to his floppy ears while he rested his massive, terrifying jaw across her little knees. Lily walked past the circle of drawn guns without breaking stride. 12 feet, 8 feet, 4 feet. She did not stare into the dog's lethal bloodshot eyes. With the uncorrupted instinct of a child who knew no malice, she kept her gaze softly directed at the stone floor between his front paws. Bruno's snarl faltered. The savage ridge of fur along his massive spine slowly began to flatten. Lily stopped right in front of the beast's dripping fangs. She dropped down onto her small knees directly in the pool of cold shadow. She let go of her plush bear, opening both of her tiny arms wide, the exact gesture a child uses when offering an unconditional embrace to someone waking from a nightmare. Then, in a soft, clear, honeyed whisper that echoed through every silent corridor of the immense mansion, she spoke the words not a single grown man in that house had the humanity to conceive. "Bruno, let them save him." The massive Caucasian shepherd shuddered from his ears to his tail. A low, trembling whine escaped his throat, the sound of a loyal soldier who had carried an impossible, agonizing burden all by himself, finally hearing someone give him permission to rest. Slowly, carefully, Bruno lowered his massive, terrifying head. He pressed the side of his heavy, scarred face directly into Lily's tiny, warm, upturned palm. Lily lifted her other hand, framing the beast's jaw with both of her small hands, gently stroking the coarse fur behind his ears with tender, rhythmic pats. "Good boy," she whispered softly. "I'm right here. You did good." Bruno took 2 slow steps to the side, completely uncovering the bleeding, unconscious form of Murphy Moretti. He sank down onto his haunches, leaning his entire 150-pound weight gently against the little girl's side, his amber eyes fixed entirely on her face. "Move! Clear a path now!" Renata Moss, the estate's newly contracted private triage nurse, a woman with 8 years of combat zone surgical experience, did not wait for the men to process their shock. She vaulted over the fallen debris, her trauma kit snapping open on the marble before the dust had even settled. Two men on the stretcher, left side approach only, slow and steady, Renata commanded with the cold, absolute authority of a battlefield commander. Gauze, pressure dressings on the exit wound, prep 2 bags of O-negative plasma immediately. The 4 veteran doctors, paralyzed moments before by fear, scrambled to obey the young nurse's blistering orders. Throughout the chaotic scramble of intubation and chest tube placement, Bruno never growled again. He simply sat beside Lily, allowing the paramedics to lift Murphy's limp body onto the gurney, his massive paw resting over the hem of her little red dress. Outside, the sirens of the unmarked private armored ambulances wailed into the misty coastal night. The motorcade tore down the gravel drive toward the private surgical facility in Providence at 80 miles per hour. For 5 hours and 40 minutes, while orthopedic and vascular surgeons fought inside Operating Room 3 to repair Murphy Moretti's shattered ribs and lacerated spleen, Bruno lay stationed like a granite sentinel outside the double swinging doors. He refused water. He refused food. He allowed only Renata Moss to pass without scrutiny, recognizing the scent of the woman who had pressed her bare hands into his master's chest to keep his heart beating. 31 agonizing hours elapsed before the monitors inside the 4th-floor private recovery suite began to steady. The heavy coastal fog beat softly against the reinforced glass windows. Murphy Moretti's eyelids fluttered, groaning through the heavy haze of fentanyl and surgical anesthesia. His vision cleared slowly, settling on the ceiling moldings, then drifting to the foot of his bed where Renata Moss stood logging his vitals onto a steel clipboard. Murphy's throat was dry as ash. He parted his cracked lips, his voice nothing more than a hoarse, guttural rasp. "Brew. No." Renata did not look up from her chart immediately. "The dog is alive and uninjured, Mr. Moretti," she said in an even, measured tone. "He has been sleeping across your threshold since yesterday morning. He hasn't left your side." Murphy closed his eyes for several seconds, letting out a ragged breath of profound relief. When he opened them again, his dark, calculating gaze locked onto the nurse. "Who?" Murphy whispered, the pain in his side flaring like molten iron. "Who broke the guard? Who calmed him?" Renata paused, setting her pen down on the metal tray with a deliberate click. She walked to the door, opened it slightly, and signaled to Marco Rinaldi, who had been waiting in the hallway with bloodshot eyes and an unlit cigarette behind his ear. Marco walked into the room, his usual swagger entirely stripped away, looking at his boss with an expression bordering on spiritual awe. "Tell me, Marco," Murphy demanded, his voice gaining a sliver of its terrifying gravel edge. "Who reached him?" Marco swallowed hard, staring at the floor before meeting the eyes of the most dangerous man in the state. "It wasn't any of our men, boss," Marco said softly. "It wasn't the doctors. It wasn't the commands." "Then who?" "Allie Carter's 3-year-old girl," Marco replied, his voice cracking slightly. "Little Lily, in her sleeping pajamas and that little red dress. She walked straight into his jaws, took him by the cheeks, and told him to let us save you." Murphy stared at his lieutenant in absolute, paralyzed silence. A memory, faint, distant, and previously discarded as trivial background noise, resurfaced in his mind. He remembered walking past the sunlit courtyard outside his private study 100 times over the past year. He remembered seeing a flash of red cotton near the grass, a little girl sitting with a plush bear next to the massive, terrifying hound he used to intimidate foreign syndicates. He had walked past that child every single week without ever stopping, without ever asking her name, treating her as nothing more than a ghost in his grand house. And in his darkest hour, when his empire crumbled and his closest confidant stood paralyzed by terror, that very ghost had stepped between death and his shattered body. Murphy looked toward the window, his jaw tightening as a solitary tear tracked down his weathered cheek. "Bring Allie Carter and her child to the main wing," Murphy ordered, his voice trembling with an emotion none of his capos had ever heard from him before. "From this second onward, that little girl is Moretti blood. Anyone who looks at her wrong doesn't get a trial. They get erased." On the 6th day following the assassination attempt, the private motorcade rolled back through the wrought iron gates of the Newport estate. The damp Atlantic wind carried the raw scent of salt and crushed pine, whipping gray mist across the manicured lawns. Murphy Moretti did not walk up the grand marble staircase of the East Wing. By strict medical decree issued by Renata Moss, a temporary recovery suite had been constructed within 48 hours on the ground floor, shielded from stairs, drafty corridors, and the restless ghosts of the night he almost died. "No meetings," Renati stated flatly, adjusting the four-drip stand as the orderlies transferred Murphy from the stretcher to the wide, low-set mahogany bed. "No capos smoking cigars in the corner. No phone calls from Providence shipping terminals. If your heart rate spikes above 90 beats per minute within the next 2 weeks, Mr. Moretti, I will personally sedate you until you resemble a piece of fine antique furniture." Murphy winced as a sharp twinge of pain flared deep beneath his sutured flesh. He looked up at the young, unflinching combat nurse, a faint, humorless smirk touching the corner of his lips. "You have a remarkably poor bedside manner for someone hired by Marco," Murphy rasped, his voice still roughened by the lingering effects of the breathe-in tube. "Good bedside manner doesn't stop sepsis," Renati replied without missing a beat, snapping her medical bag shut with a sharp metallic click. "I'm here to keep you breathing. The rest of your empire can burn to the ground for all I care, as long as it doesn't disturb my vital sign logs." She turned on her heel and strode out of the room, leaving Murphy alone in the quiet, sterile twilight of his new confinement. Or rather, he was almost alone. Beneath the heavy mahogany desk, where a stack of unread intelligence reports lay waiting, a low, rhythmic sigh resonated against the floorboards. Bruno did not lie under the desk today. Since the moment the medical van's doors had swung open in the gravel courtyard, the massive Caucasian shepherd had refused to break contact with the perimeter of Murphy's bed. His heavy chin rested squarely across his front paws, his amber eyes fixed not on the door or the windows, but on the small, unassuming oak threshold leading out to the staff quarters. For 6 solid years, Bruno's posture had been defined by eternal vigilance. Ears cocked, muscles coiled, perpetually scanning for a breach. Yet now, in the dim light of the ground floor suite, his shoulders were slack. The chronic, razor-sharp tension that had made him the most feared beast in 3 states had dissolved into a profound, exhausted peace. The dog had 2 people now, and one of them hadn't even learned how to tie her own shoelaces yet. It was precisely 3:00 p.m. on the 2nd day of his return when the heavy oak door creaked open by a mere 6 inches. No knuckles tapped against the wood. No formal announcement preceded the intrusion. A small, pink hand pushed the barrier wider, followed closely by the familiar rustle of a faded red cotton dress. Lily stepped into the room. She walked with the slow, deliberate caution of a cat exploring a forbidden garden, clutching a fresh sheet of heavy construction paper in both hands. Murphy stopped reading the dossier in his lap. He raised his dark, penetrating eyes, the same eyes that had brought hardened syndicate bosses to their knees, and locked them entirely onto the 3-year-old child. Lily did not stop at the edge of the rug. She marched straight past the massive form of Bruno, who gave a single affectionate thump of his tail against the wool, and halted directly beside the edge of Murphy's low bed. She held up the piece of paper, drawn in wobbly, thick strokes of yellow, brown, and black crayon, was a crude yet unmistakable image. A towering stick figure with a jagged red slash across its ribs. A massive, furry blob with oversized ears sitting faithfully at its feet, and a tiny red-clad figure standing triumphantly between them, holding a bright yellow circle. "Butterscotch," Lily announced solemnly, pointing her small finger directly at the yellow circle. "For you, and for Bruno." Murphy stared down at the crude drawing. A strange, unfamiliar sensation bloomed behind his breastbone. A dull, aching pressure that had nothing to do with the surgical steel holding his abdominal wall together. In his 38 years of life, people had given him millions of dollars in kickbacks, blood diamonds, deeds to waterfront properties, and encrypted flash drives containing the confessions of his enemies. Not a single soul had ever handed him a crayon drawing of a candy. He reached out with a slow, deliberate movement, his fingers calloused from decades of handling firearms, and took the paper from her small hands with infinite care. "Did your mother give you this?" Murphy asked, his voice softening into a register that none of his lieutenants would ever have believed he possessed. "Mom's busy making soup," Lily said simply, turning around and sliding down to sit cross-legged on the Persian rug right beside Bruno's front paws. She reached out, burying her tiny fingers deep into the thick, dark ruff around the dog's neck, beginning a slow, rhythmic scratching motion that immediately caused Bruno to close his eyes in pure canine bliss. Murphy leaned back against the goose-down pillows, his gaze drifting back and forth between the child and the beast. The silence in the room was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was filled only with the steady hiss of the oxygen monitor and the soft, rhythmic breathing of 2 creatures who had quietly rewritten the rules of his entire existence. 10 minutes later, the door clicked open again, and Elias Ward stepped inside, his face pale, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the harsh glare of the desk lamp. Elias glanced down at the child sitting on the floor, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then stepped closer to the bed, lowering his voice to a near inaudible whisper. "Boss," Elias murmured, keeping his eyes fixed on the manila folder in his hands. "We traced the IP address that overrode the North Gate access code at 11:31 p.m. on the night of the attack." Murphy's expression instantly shed its warmth, hardening back into the cold, impenetrable mask of the underworld sovereign. The dark void in his eyes returned, sharp and lethal as a drawn blade. "Whose account was it, Elias?" Murphy asked, his voice dropping into a low, mincing purr that made the air in the room feel 10 degrees colder. "It wasn't an external hack, and it wasn't an enforcer gone rogue," Elias replied grimly, sliding a single printed verification sheet onto the corner of the mattress. The credentials used were authenticated through a 2-factor physical token kept inside the main estate vault, Only 3 people in this entire organization possessed the clearance level to authorize that specific protocol. Murphy did not look at the paper. He already knew the answer before Elias even formed the syllables. The same man who had brewed coffee with dried orange peel to mimic his mother's recipe. The same man who had held him when he was 13 years old and grieving over a fresh grave. Raphael, Murphy whispered, the name tasting like ash and iron on his tongue. And there's more, Elias continued, his voice tightening. Dr. Voss's financial records show 3 wire transfers originating from an offshore shell company linked directly to Raphael's secondary holdings in the Caymans. The sedative they pumped into your foreline during the surgery wasn't meant to save you, boss. It was calibrated to keep you under long enough for a clean, untraceable extraction. Murphy closed his eyes. A cold, dead fury seized his chest, a rage far more potent than the physical agony at his wound. For 26 years, he had bled for the family, trusted blindly, and built an empire on the absolute sanctity of blood loyalty. And the man he called uncle had sold him out to the highest bidder for a handful of dirt and a collapsing throne. "Keep digging," Murphy commanded, his voice shaking with restrained violence. Every bank account, every offshore contact, every associate he's spoken to in the last 12 months. I want a complete, airtight web of evidence before the month is out. Understood, Elias nodded once, turning on his heel to leave. Elias, Murphy called out softly, just as the intelligence chief reached the door. Boss? Murphy looked down at the floor, where Lily had curled up against Bruno's warm flank, fast asleep with her thumb tucked securely against her cheek while the massive dog kept motionless watch over her breathing. Double the perimeter guards around the east wing, Murphy ordered coldly. If anyone, capos, doctors, or council members steps within 50 feet of this hallway, without my direct authorization. He let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished, but the unspoken promise of absolute slaughter resonated clearly in the silence. Kill them on sight, Elias finished for him, and walked out into the corridor. Murphy picked up Lily's crayon drawing from the blanket, holding it tightly in his palm. The storm was coming. The Council of Families would soon demand an explanation for the blood on the estate stones. The wolves were circling the wounded lion, licking their chops in the dark, believing the apex predator had finally been brought low. They had calculated every variable. They had bribed the doctors, hacked the gates, and mapped the blind spots of the cameras. But they had forgotten one fundamental equation of survival. They had never accounted for a 3-year-old girl in a red dress, a jar of butterscotch candies, and a dog who refused to let his master die alone. The autumn chill outside the Newport estate deepened, wrapping the sprawling stone architecture in a shroud of gray, unyielding fog. Inside the converted ground-floor medical suite of the East Wing, however, the air was dead and stifling. Murphy Moretti lay propped against a stack of goose-down pillows, his dark eyes fixed unblinkingly on the heavy oak door. The report Elias Ward had delivered hours earlier still burned like acid in his memory. Offshore wire transfers, encrypted communication logs, and the cold, undeniable fingerprint of betrayal. The man who had taught him how to open his first safe at 16. The man who had brewed orange peel coffee to comfort a grieving orphan, was the very architect of the bloodbath that nearly erased the Moretti dynasty. A soft, measured knock rapped twice against the door. Before Murphy could issue a command, the heavy wood swung inward. Raphael stepped into the room. At 54, the high-ranking consigliere moved with the deliberate, unhurried grace of an apex predator who believed his throne was already secured. He wore a tailored charcoal wool overcoat, his silvering hair combed back with immaculate precision, and carried a heavy ceramic mug that emanated the faint, distinct aroma of dried orange peel and roasted coffee beans. "How is my boy holding up?" Raphael asked, his voice dripping with a carefully calibrated warmth that had once comforted Murphy through his darkest nights. He walked smoothly toward the bedside, setting the ceramic mug down precisely on the edge of the nightstand, right beside a wobbly, crayon-drawn picture of a dog eating candy. Murphy did not touch the mug. He did not even look at it. His piercing gaze remained locked on Raphael's eyes, searching for the microscopic twitch, the hidden tremor of a man standing on the edge of an abyss. "The stitches are holding, Raphael," Murphy replied, his voice dangerously low, stripped of all warmth. "Though I'm told the recovery would have been much quicker if certain people hadn't arranged for my 4-line to be spiked with slow-acting hypotension agents." Raphael's expression did not crack. Not a single muscle in his face betrayed the slightest hint of panic. Instead, a mask of sorrowful disbelief settled over his features as he pulled a chair close to the mattress and sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. "Murphy, you can't possibly believe the council is entertaining those absurd rumors." Raphael sighed, shaking his head with an air of profound disappointment. "The underworld is crawling with rats right now. Someone wants to fracture our foundation from within. You've been isolated, wounded, and paranoid since the night of the attack. But you must remember who raised you. I carried you through your father's funeral. I would pull the trigger on anyone who tried to harm a hair on your head." The words were spoken with absolute theatrical conviction. To any outsider, it was the sound of a devoted father pleading with a suspicious son. But across the room, a low tectonic shift shattered the theater of lies. Bruno did not growl. In 6 years of guards in this house, the massive Caucasian shepherd had never once broken protocol by snarling without a direct command. Yet as Raphael leaned forward to clasp Murphy's hand, the 150-pound war dog executed a movement so violent and absolute that the floorboards groaned beneath his paws. Bruno rose from the Persian rug. He did not slide back under the desk. He planted himself squarely between Raphael's chair and Murphy's bed. His ears flattened flat against his massive skull. His lips peeled back in absolute, unadulterated revulsion, exposing yellowing fangs dripping with thick saliva. The sheer, suffocating pressure of a predator locking onto a traitor filled the entire room, making the air taste like copper and ozone. Raphael froze mid-motion. His hand hovered a foot away from Murphy's blanket. For the first time, the color drained slightly from the older man's cheeks as he stared down into the glowing amber eyes of the beast that had held 30 armed men at bay. "The dog is still traumatized from the siege, Murphy," Raphael muttered, his voice tightening slightly as he slowly pulled his hand back and rested it on his knee. "You really ought to put him down. A beast that loses its mind like this is a liability to the entire estate." Murphy let out a cold, humorless laugh that sent a sharp spike of pain through his healing abdomen. "Bruno doesn't lose his mind, Raphael," Murphy whispered, his voice sharpening into a lethal blade. "And he certainly doesn't make mistakes about who belongs in this house." Before Raphael could formulate a counter-argument, the heavy door clicked open once more. The tense, lethal vacuum in the room vanished the second a flash of faded red cotton darted past the threshold. Lily marched into the suite, completely oblivious to the cold war being fought over the bedsheets. She clutched a fresh piece of construction paper in her small hand, her brown eyes wide and focused entirely on her favorite furry giant. She stopped dead in her tracks, noticing Raphael blocking her usual path to the dog. She tilted her head, blinking up at the immaculately dressed consigliere with the innocent curiosity of a child evaluating an unfamiliar piece of furniture. Raphael looked down at the little girl, a polite, condescending smile plastered across his face. He had heard the whispers among the staff about the housekeeper's brat wandering the halls, but he had dismissed her as irrelevant background noise, a disposable insect in a world of wolves. "Well, hello there, little one," Raphael chuckled smoothly, forcing a gentle tone. "Run along back to the kitchen now. The adults are discussing important family business." Lily did not move an inch. She did not blink. She simply turned her head away from Raphael as if he were entirely invisible, walked straight around his chair, and dropped down onto her knees, right beside Bruno's terrifying bared fang jaw. Bruno's rigid spine instantly softened. The terrifying rumble in his chest subsided into a gentle, rhythmic purr. He lowered his massive head, pressing his cheek against Lily's tiny shoulder as she wrapped both arms around his neck and handed him her new crayon drawing. A clumsy, beautiful picture of a dog, a man, and a little girl standing under a bright yellow sun. Raphael watched the exchange with a flicker of genuine disgust in his eyes. He stood up, brushing a speck of dust off his expensive wool coat, shaking his head in quiet disapproval. "It seems your standards have lowered drastically, Murphy," Raphael said smoothly, walking toward the door. "Allowing staff and stray children to overrun your recovery suite. Take care of yourself, my boy. The council meets in 6 days to discuss the succession vacuum. I hope you're well enough to attend." He turned and strode out into the hallway, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him with a final, echoing thud. Murphy stared at the closed door for a long, silent minute. The mask of civility melted entirely off his face, replaced by a cold, absolute resolve forged in blood and betrayal. He looked down at Lily, who was happily whispering secrets into Bruno's ear, completely unaware that she had just stood in the crosshairs of an executioner. Murphy reached out, picking up the ceramic mug Raphael had left behind. He sniffed the rim, catching the heavy scent of orange peel masking the subtle, metallic almond tang of potassium cyanide. He set the mug down very slowly. He pulled a secure encrypted burner phone from beneath his pillow and dialed a single digit on speed dial. "Marco," Murphy said into the receiver, his voice dropping into the icy register of an underworld executioner. "Bring Elias to my room immediately. The war has begun." The heavy oak door had barely clicked shut behind Raphael when the atmosphere in the private suite plummeted into a sub-zero vacuum of pure, unadulterated menace. Murphy Moretti did not shout. He did not smash the ceramic rug containing the poisoned orange peel tea. And standing quietly, a step behind them with a cold, professional clipboard in hand was Renata Moss. Raphael's face lost every trace of color. The composure that had served him for decades fractured instantly, his jaw dropping a fraction of an inch as he stared at the man who was supposed to be bedridden, heavily sedated, and rapidly declining from systemic poison. "Murphy," Raphael stammered, half rising from his chair, his voice losing its steady baritone. You shouldn't be out of bed. The doctor said—" "The doctors I hired report to me, Raphael, not to you," Murphy interrupted, his voice dropping into a lethal glacial purr that paralyzed every man in the room. Murphy walked slowly down the center aisle, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone floor until he stopped directly opposite Raphael at the head of the table. He did not sit down. He simply rested both hands on the polished wood, leaning forward to loom over his traitorous mentor like a gathering storm cloud. "You speak of stability, Raphael," Murphy said softly, his eyes locking onto the older man's sweating forehead. You speak of protecting the family from external threats, yet for the past 6 days, while I lay recovering from an assassination attempt, you've been busy counting votes, dividing up my territories, and drafting the paperwork for a hostile takeover. That is a slanderous accusation. Raphael forced a harsh defensive laugh, looking desperately around the table at the other elders. He is delirious from his injuries, gentlemen. Look at him. He's grasping at shadows because he cannot accept that his time has passed. Is it a shadow, Raphael? Murphy asked quietly. He turned his head slightly and gave a single, imperceptible nod to Elias Ward. Elias stepped forward, dropped the heavy leather briefcase onto the table, and flipped open the steel latches. With surgical precision, Elias connected a secure digital cable from the briefcase to the banquet hall's massive overhead projection screen. The blank white screen flickered to life. Instantly crisp, high-definition financial records materialized across the display. Offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, wire transfer receipts totaling millions of dollars, and digital communication packets bearing the private encryption keys of Raphael's personal study. Gasps echoed through the room. Several elder capos leaned forward, their eyes widening in horror as they read the damning transaction IDs. Those can be forged, Raphael shouted, his voice cracking with rising panic as he slammed both fists onto the table. Digital fabrication. Any hacker in Boston can manufacture a fake ledger. Indeed they can, Raphael, Elias replied smoothly, adjusting his glasses without missing a beat. Which is why we didn't rely solely on digital logs. Elias tapped his tablet again. The screen shifted, displaying a crystal-clear, high-resolution security camera still image captured inside the estate's east wing at 11:31 p.m. on the night of the attack. The image clearly showed the primary estate vault terminal illuminated by the cold blue glow of a monitor, with a physical two-factor security token plugged into the master port. Engraved clearly on the side of the token was a distinct serial number. Raphael's serial number. The room plunged into a tomb-like silence so deep that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like falling boulders. And just in case physical hardware security isn't enough to convince the council, Murphy continued, his voice as cold as an Arctic wind, let's talk about the hospitality you showed me earlier this week. Murphy reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the heavy ceramic mug Raphael had left on his bedside table, and set it down with a heavy, deliberate thud right in the center of the oak conference table. My personal physician, Dr. Leonard Voss, kindly confessed to the formulation inside this cup 40 minutes ago, Murphy whispered, leaning down so close to Raphael that the older man could feel the chill of his breath. Micro-encapsulated potassium cyanide, disguised as orange peel tea, a final, affectionate parting gift from the man who raised me. Raphael slumped back into his leather chair. The mask had completely shattered. His lips trembled and his eyes darted frantically around the table toward the other capos. But every single man at the council had already pushed their chairs back 3 feet, distancing themselves from the condemned traitor as if he carried a contagious plague. Take him, Murphy commanded. Before Raphael could draw another breath, Marco Rinaldi and 2 elite enforcers were already behind him. A pair of heavy steel zip ties snapped tight around Raphael's wrists with a harsh, merciless click. They hauled him out of his chair, dragging his struggling, disgraced body backward, down the center aisle as he cursed, thrashed, and pleaded for mercy, that no one in the room was willing to grant. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, sealing Raphael's fate forever. Murphy stood alone at the head of the table. He did not smile. He did not look triumphant. He simply surveyed the silent, terrified faces of the council elders, knowing with absolute certainty that no one in this room, or across the entire eastern seaboard, would ever dare question his throne again. "The meeting is adjourned," Murphy said quietly. He turned on his heel and walked out of the banquet hall, leaving the empire behind him for a moment, his mind drifting back to the ground floor East Wing suite, where a little girl in a red dress was probably sitting on the floor right now, waiting to show him another crayon drawing of a dog, a man, and a candy. The heavy scent of cordite and political execution faded from the Newport estate within 48 hours, replaced by the crisp, biting salt air of the late Atlantic autumn. In the wake of the council summit, the internal cancer that had threatened to rot the Moretti syndicate from within was excised with surgical, merciless precision. Raphael was stripped of every title, share, and geographic territory he had accumulated over 3 decades, his name formally erased from the family registries before being placed on a private cargo freighter bound for an indefinite solitary exile across the sea. His co-conspirators, cowed by the sheer speed and absolute lethality of Murphy's counterstrike, fell back into line with trembling obedience. Not a single capo across the eastern seaboard dared to whisper a word of dissent. Yet inside the converted ground floor suite of the East Wing, the man who commanded thousands of armed soldiers and multi-billion-dollar shipping routes was fighting an entirely different kind of battle. "If I catch you out of that bed before the fascial wall is fully knitted, Mr. Moretti, I will personally tie your ankles to the bedposts with industrial medical gauze," Renata Moss announced, standing at the foot of the bed with her arms crossed over her crisp white coat, fixing Murphy with a glare that could shatter diamonds. Murphy winced, leaning back against the plush, goose-down pillows with a faint, sardonic twitch of his lips. He was sitting upright for the first time in nearly a week, wearing a loose black silk lounge shirt that concealed the fading surgical scars across his left ribs. "You have a terrifying imagination for a healthcare professional, Nurse Moss," Murphy rasped, his voice regaining its deep, resonant authority. "I've survived 8 years in combat triage zones by possessing a profound lack of patience for stubborn, bleeding idiots," Renata retorted smoothly, jotting down a final set of vital statistics on her steel clipboard. "Your heart rate is stable, your blood pressure is normalizing, and your white blood cell count is finally where it should be. You're physically healing, but don't mistake survival for invulnerability." She turned on her heel and strode toward the door, pausing just before the threshold. "Oh, and by the way, your 3-year-old visitor is currently bypassing the perimeter guards in the hallway. Good luck." Before Murphy could respond, the heavy oak door creaked open by a mere hand's breadth. A flash of faded red cotton slipped into the room. Lily walked in with the unhurried royal dignity of a tiny empress inspecting her private gardens. Behind her, moving with the silent, fluid grace of a shadow, Bruno padded softly across the Persian rug, his massive tail giving a gentle, rhythmic wag as he settled himself directly beside the mattress. Lily was holding a fresh sheet of construction paper in her small hands, her dark eyes wide and filled with intense concentration. Murphy's hardened expression melted instantly, his dark eyes softening into an expression of profound, tender warmth that no living soul outside these 4 walls would ever witness. "Good afternoon, little captain," Murphy murmured, extending a large, calloused hand toward the edge of the mattress. "What mission have you brought me today?" Lily did not speak immediately. She carefully climbed up onto the heavy velvet footstool, scrambled onto the edge of the bed with practiced agility, and crawled across the blankets until she was sitting cross-legged right beside Murphy's chest. She held up her new drawing. This time, the crude crayon lines depicted something extraordinary. A towering black figure with a golden crown, a massive furry beast with oversized floppy ears, and a tiny, red-clad figure standing between them, holding two glowing yellow circles. 2 candies, Lily announced solemnly, pointing her small finger at the circles. 1 for you, 1 for Bruno, because you're both good boys now. A sudden, fierce tightness gripped Murphy's throat. He reached out with infinite care, taking the paper from her tiny hands as if it were a fragile, priceless artifact of the ancient world. He traced the clumsy, wobbly lines with the tip of his finger, feeling an overwhelming surge of emotion that eclipsed every victory, every territorial conquest, and every piece of gold he had ever claimed in his bloody career. 2 candies, Murphy repeated softly, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across his weathered face. Thank you, Lily. I shall treasure this above all else. Satisfied with her work, Lily turned around, leaned back against Bruno's warm, massive shoulder, and let out a soft, contented sigh. The 150-pound war dog rested his heavy chin across her small knees, his amber eyes half closed in absolute, devoted bliss. At that exact moment, the door opened slightly again, and Allie Carter stood in the doorway, her hands nervously clutching a fresh stack of fresh linens, her expression a mix of lingering awe and maternal hesitation. Mr. Moretti, Allie began softly, lowering her gaze to the floor. I hope she isn't disturbing your rest. I can take her back to the kitchens if— Never, Murphy interrupted her, his voice carrying an absolute, unshakable finality that made Allie pause. He looked up from the drawing, locking his intense, dark gaze onto the young housekeeper. From this day forward, Allie, you and Lily are no longer staff in this house. The East Wing is your home. Your safety, your future, and your peace are under the direct, unyielding protection of the Moretti name. If anyone at all, ever looks at either of you with the slightest disrespect, they answer directly to me. Allie's breath caught in her throat. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she pressed a trembling hand against her mouth, nodding mutely as profound gratitude washed over her weary face. She had spent 3 years hiding in the shadows of this terrifying fortress, praying she and her daughter would survive the violence that pulsed through its halls. She had never imagined that the Lord of the Underworld would offer them a sanctuary built not on fear, but on unconditional love. Thank you, sir, Allie whispered, her voice choked with emotion, before quietly pulling the door shut to leave them in their peace. Murphy leaned back against the pillows, wrapping one arm gently around Lily's small shoulder, while his other hand rested on Bruno's thick, warm ruff. The sun broke through the heavy Atlantic fog outside, casting a golden, amber shaft of light across the wooden floorboards, illuminating the crayon drawings taped in a crooked row along the wall. Power could build an empire of stone and steel. Money could buy the loyalty of armies and the silence of kings. But it took a 3-year-old girl in a red dress, a jar of butterscotch candies, and a broken-hearted beast to teach the most dangerous man in New England what it truly meant to be alive. The winter snows of New England descended upon the Newport coastline with a relentless, blinding fury, wrapping the sprawling limestone architecture of the Moretti estate in a thick, insulating blanket of white. 6 months had passed since the bloody coup of the council and the absolute purging of Raphael's network. Inside the master study on the second floor, Murphy Moretti sat behind the massive mahogany desk, the very place where an assassin's bullet had nearly ended his reign half a year ago. The glass had long since been replaced. The security grid had been upgraded to military-grade quantum encryption by Elias Ward, making the fortress utterly impregnable from both the digital and physical realms. Murphy's fingers tapped a steady, rhythmic beat against the polished wood as he reviewed the quarterly shipping manifests from Providence and Boston. His recovery was absolute. The physical scars across his left ribs remained, but they served only as a permanent, cold reminder of the night his empire almost fractured, and the night an innocent child and a scarred beast dragged him back from the edge of the abyss. A soft tap sounded at the heavy double doors. Before Murphy could speak, Marco Rinaldi pushed the wood open and stepped inside, his expression carrying the grim, professional focus of a man who smelled trouble on the wind. "Boss," Marco said, quietly closing the door behind him and walking briskly toward the desk. Elias's perimeter sensors picked up an unauthorized thermal signature 3 miles out on the coastal access road. 4 unmarked vehicles, heavy utility vans. They're moving without transponders, hugging the tree line to bypass the outer cameras. Murphy did not flinch. He did not even look up from his financial ledgers immediately. A cold, razor-thin smile touched the corners of his lips, the expression of a master apex predator smelling the scent of foolish prey, walking straight into a trap. "The Boston Syndicate remnants," Murphy murmured, his voice as smooth and deadly as an uncoiling viper. "They waited 6 months, hoping I'd let my guard down while playing the doting patriarch." "Shall I mobilize the outer enforcers and intercept them at the ridge?" Marco asked, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. "No," Murphy replied, standing up slowly and buttoning the front of his custom charcoal suit jacket. "Let them cross the outer gate. Let them believe the intelligence leaks they bought from my disgraced captains are still valid. When they step into the courtyard, I want them to understand once and for all what happens when anyone dares cast a shadow over this house." "Understood, boss," Marco nodded, a lethal gleam in his eyes before he turned and vanished out the door. Down in the East Wing, however, the impending violence of the outside world felt a million miles away. The ground-floor medical suite had long since been converted into a sunlit, comfortable playroom and study, though its primary occupant still treated it as her personal kingdom. Lily, now sporting a brand-new, brighter red winter coat with a fluffy white faux fur trim, sat cross-legged on the plush Persian rug. She was holding a brand-new box of Crayola crayons, a gift Murphy had personally shipped from a specialty boutique in New York, and was furiously working on her masterpiece. Beside her, stretched out like an enormous sleeping black rug, Bruno let out a long, contented snore. Though his muzzle had turned slightly gray around the edges with age, his sheer physical presence remained a terrifying deterrent to anyone foolish enough to test the estate's inner sanctum. Renata Moss sat at the small reading table near the window, reviewing a stack of general health charts for the estate staff. She had fulfilled her original 3-month medical contract long ago, but when Murphy offered her a permanent retainer as the estate's chief medical advisor with double her previous salary, she had accepted, not for the money, but because she had grown strangely fond of the chaotic, dangerous, yet strangely grounding ecosystem of the Moretti Fortress. "Lily, darling, you're getting blue crayon all over your sleeve," Wanata noted with a gentle, amused smile, leaning over to wipe a stray smudge of pigment off the little girl's wrist. "It's for the sky, Auntie Renata," Lily announced proudly, holding up the drawing to show a chaotic yet vibrant splash of blue, red, and black. "The big dog is flying in the sky today." "Is that so?" a deep, resonant voice echoed from the doorway. Both Renata and Lily looked up. Murphy stood in the threshold, his dark overcoat draped over his arm. His severe underworld persona completely melted away the second his eyes locked onto the small child. Lily scrambled up from the floor, abandoning her crayons, and ran across the room as fast as her little boots could carry her, slamming straight into Murphy's knees with an enthusiastic hug. Murphy dropped down onto one knee, ignoring the pristine fabric of his trousers as they brushed the rug, and scooped Lily up into his arms with effortless strength. "You've gotten heavier, little captain," Murphy chuckled, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her dark curls. "Soon you'll be too big to carry." "Never," Lily declared, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck and planting a sticky, enthusiastic kiss right on his cheek. "I'll always be your little girl." Renata watched the interaction from the table, a soft, wistful smile touching her lips. She had seen ruthless cartel bosses, corrupt politicians, and hardened enforcers tremble before this man. Yet here, holding a 3-year-old girl who wore a red coat, he was nothing more than a father who had finally found something worth dying for. Suddenly, the warm, peaceful air of the East Wing was shattered. Boom! A dull, distant, concussive shockwave rattled the reinforced glass window panes, followed immediately by the sharp, undeniable crack of suppressed automatic gunfire echoing from the north perimeter courtyard. Renata's smile vanished instantly, her professional instincts kicking in as she stood up straight. "What was that?" Murphy's expression hardened in a fraction of a second. The warmth in his dark eyes evaporated, replaced once more by the freezing, calculated fury of the underworld sovereign. He set Lily down gently behind the heavy oak desk, pulling a steel-reinforced security panel open with a hidden key and locking the internal titanium shutters over the windows. "Stay right here, Lily," Murphy instructed, his voice dropping into a calm, absolute register. "And don't open this door for anyone except me, Marco, or Renata." "Are they bad guys?" Lily asked, her big brown eyes wide with innocent curiosity, completely devoid of real fear because she was standing inside the fortress built by the giant dog and the man in the black coat. "Just some visitors who forgot their manners," Murphy replied smoothly. He reached beneath his armpit, pulling out his custom-engraved CSR, checking the magazine with a practiced, lethal click before sliding it back into his holster. He turned to Renata, who was already grabbing her trauma kit off the shelf with combat zone efficiency. "Keep her safe." "Always," Renata said firmly. Murphy stepped out into the corridor, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. As he walked down the dimly lit hallway toward the grand courtyard, Bruno padded silently right beside his left boot, his massive shoulders brushing against Murphy's trousers, his amber eyes locked forward with the terrifying, eager focus of a war dog returning to the field. Up above, through the security monitors lining the grand hall, Murphy watched the chaos unfold. 4 Boston tactical vans had breached the outer iron gate, their headlights blindingly bright in the falling snow. Dozens of masked gunmen poured out, attempting to rush the front steps. They were met with an absolute wall of lead. Marco Rinaldi and 40 Moretti enforcers opened fire from the fortified stone balconies, cutting down the vanguard in seconds. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Murphy walked out onto the grand front steps, standing in the freezing blizzard without a coat, the falling snow melting instantly against his heated skin. He raised his pistol, sighted down the barrel through the swirling white flakes, and pulled the trigger. The last remnants of the Boston Syndicate fell into the red-stained snow, their brief, suicidal invasion extinguished before they even reached the first landing. Silence returned to the Newport estate, broken only by the howling Atlantic wind and the crunch of boots on ice. Murphy lowered his smoking weapon. He looked down at Bruno, who stood proudly beside him, shaking the snowflakes from his thick black fur. The house was safe. The blood had been washed away. And inside the east wing, a little girl in a red coat was probably finishing her drawing of a dog flying in the blue sky. The winter frost that had gripped the Newport coastline finally yielded to the gentle, hesitant warmth of an early spring thaw. The blood-stained snow of the previous month had melted away, nourishing the sprawling emerald lawns that rolled down toward the crashing Atlantic surf. Inside the massive stone fortress of the Moretti estate, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of perpetual war had completely dissolved, replaced by a strange, almost surreal sense of domestic peace. The remnant of the Boston Syndicate had been swept into the dustbin of history, their leadership shattered, their territories absorbed into the burgeoning, legitimate commercial empire that Murphy Moretti now commanded with an iron yet unshakable hand. No one challenged him. No one dared utter a whisper of dissent. The underworld had learned a permanent, bloody lesson. You could strike at the lion, but if you threatened the sparrow under his wing, the entire world would burn to ash. On a bright Saturday morning in May, the grand banquet hall, the very room where Raphael had once plotted his treasonous coup, was transformed into a wonderland of pastel balloons, fluttering ribbons, and the sweet, rich scent of freshly baked vanilla cake. Today was Lily's 4th birthday. In the center of the sunlit room stood a towering 4-tier castle cake, adorned with edible sugar roses, and a tiny, handcrafted marzipan figure of a massive black dog standing beside a little girl in a red dress. Allie Carter stood near the dessert table, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears of pure disbelief as she watched her daughter dart across the polished marble floor. Allie wore a soft, elegant emerald dress provided by one of New York's finest designers, a gift from Murphy that quietly signaled her permanent elevation to the inner aristocracy of the estate. She no longer scrubbed floors or carried breakfast trays in the shadows. She was the matriarch of the East Wing, a mother whose safety was anchored by an empire. "She looks like a little princess," Renata Moss murmured, walking up beside Allie with a flute of sparkling apple cider in her hand. Renata wore a sharp, tailored cream blazer, her usual clinical sternness replaced by a soft, genuine smile as she watched Lily chase a floating silver balloon. "I keep waiting to wake up," Allie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I keep thinking this is all a dream, that I'll wake up in the old cabin in Vermont, or hiding in the back of the pantry while the pens go off outside." "It's not a dream, Allie," Renata said firmly, clinking her glass gently against Allie's hand. "Some men build empires out of greed and fear. This man built his back from the ashes because a little girl reminded him what a human heartbeat actually felt like." Across the hall, standing near the arched mahogany terrace doors, Murphy Moretti watched the scene unfold. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit, unbuttoned at the collar, looking every bit the sovereign of the eastern seaboard. Yet the severe, razor-sharp edge that had once defined his every movement was completely gone. He held a small, wrapped velvet box in his right hand, his dark eyes following Lily's every skip and jump with an expression of absolute, unconditional devotion. Beside him sat Bruno. The 150-pound Caucasian shepherd was wearing a thick, festive red silk ribbon tied neatly around his massive neck, a concession to the birthday festivities that he accepted with the solemn dignity of a decorated war veteran. His amber eyes never left Lily for a fraction of a second. "She's growing up too fast, boss," Marco Rinaldi muttered, stepping up beside Murphy with a cup of black coffee, shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. "Give her another 2 years, and she'll be bossing the capos around better than we do." "Let them try," Murphy replied softly, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "Anyone who crosses her answers to both of us." At that moment, Lily stopped running. She caught sight of Murphy standing by the terrace doors, framed by the bright spring sunlight streaming in from the Atlantic. With a joyful squeak, she abandoned her balloon, sprinted across the polished marble floor as fast as her little patent leather shoes could carry her, and launched herself straight into Murphy's legs. Murphy dropped down onto one knee instantly, catching her in a powerful, effortless embrace and lifting her up into the air as she giggled with unadulterated delight. "Happy birthday, little captain," Murphy murmured, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. 4 years old today. Are you finally ready to take over the family business?" "My business is cake," Lily declared with absolute serious authority, throwing her tiny arms around his neck. "And playing with Bruno." Bruno let out a deep rumbling woof of agreement, standing up on his hind legs for a brief second to rest his massive paws against Murphy's shoulder, gently nudging Lily's cheek with his wet black nose. "Well then," Murphy swelled, holding the little velvet box out toward her, "I believe your first business asset has arrived." Lily's eyes widened as she took the small box with both hands. She fumbled clumsily with the satin ribbon until the lid popped open. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a delicate, custom-crafted silver charm bracelet. Dangling from the silver chain was a tiny, intricately detailed silver charm shaped like a butterscotch candy, alongside a microscopic golden dog and a miniature red dress. It's for me," Lily whispered, her breath catching as she stared at the shining metal. "Always," Murphy said quietly, fastening the delicate bracelet around her tiny wrist with infinite care. "So wherever you go, and whatever doors you open in this world, you'll always carry the pieces of the home we built together." Lily looked down at her wrist, then flung her arms around Murphy's neck so hard she nearly knocked him backward, burying her face against his shoulder. "Thank you, Murphy," she whispered into his ear. "I love you." The entire banquet hall went dead silent for a heartbeat. Marco turned away to wipe a sudden, uncharacteristic moisture from the corner of his eye. Allie pressed both hands to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. And Murphy Moretti, the most feared man from Boston to New York, the sovereign of blood and steel, felt a hot, blinding tear track silently down his own weathered cheek. He wrapped both arms around the little girl, holding her tighter than he had ever held anything in his entire life, knowing with absolute certainty that the dark, empty void inside his soul had finally, perfectly healed. The relentless march of time does not pause for empires, nor does it grant special mercy to the lords of the underworld. Yet, as the years drifted over the Newport coastline like shifting tides, the Moretti estate evolved from a fortress of blood and iron into something far rarer, a true home. Time carved silver threads into Murphy Moretti's dark hair, and the sharp, lethal contours of his youth softened into the dignified grace of a patriarch who had long since won every war worth fighting. The East Wing was no longer a guarded sick room. It was the beating heart of the entire estate, filled with the sound of piano scales, laughter, and the quiet, comforting chatter of a family that had risen from the ashes of betrayal. Lily was 14 now, the little girl who had once wandered out of the shadows in a crumpled red dress, clutching a one-eared teddy bear and a sticky butterscotch candy, had blossomed into a sharp-witted, brilliant young woman. She still wore red whenever the autumn wind swept in off the Atlantic, and the delicate silver charm bracelet Murphy had given her on her 4th birthday remained permanently locked around her wrist, its tiny silver butterscotch candy, golden dog, and miniature red dress catching the sunlight with every movement she made. On a warm September morning, the heavy oak doors of the master's study stood wide open. Murphy sat behind the polished mahogany desk, reviewing university prospectuses and legal foundations for the free healthcare clinic the family had established in South Providence, a project Lily had personally designed and pitched to him 6 months prior. A soft, familiar paw scraped against the hardwood floor. Murphy looked up. Bruno was old now. His massive frame, once capable of holding back 30 armed enforcers, had grown heavy and stiff with age. His muzzle was completely white, and his amber eyes clouded with the gentle haze of a long life well lived. Yet, as he walked across the room to lay his heavy chin across the toe of Murphy's leather shoe, just as he had done on the night the world nearly ended, his loyalty remained as unshakable as the stone foundations of the estate. Murphy reached down, his calloused fingers gently stroking the coarse, graying fur behind the old dog's ears. "You're getting lazy in your old age, old friend," Murphy whispered, a warm, affectionate smile touching his lips. Bruno let out a soft, rumbling sigh, closing his eyes as if agreeing completely with the assessment. Later that afternoon, the gentle warmth of the sun drew them all out onto the grand stone porch overlooking the emerald lawns. Allie Carter sat nearby, sharing a cup of tea with Renata Moss, their quiet laughter blending with the distant sound of the crashing surf. Marco Rinaldi leaned against a stone pillar, smoking a rare cigar while keeping a watchful, affectionate eye on the horizon. Lily walked out from the double doors, holding a fresh batch of lemon-scented cookies she had baked herself in the estate kitchen. She knelt beside Bruno, feeding him a small piece of pastry that the old dog accepted with infinite gentleness, before walking over to Murphy and handing him a steaming cup of coffee infused with a curl of dried orange peel. Murphy took the cup, inhaling the familiar, comforting aroma that instantly bridged the gap between his mother's distant memory and the vibrant reality of the present. He looked at Lily, then down at the old dog, resting peacefully in the afternoon light, and finally out across the iron gates that marked the boundary of his vast, untouchable empire. Power could shatter armies. Money could buy the silence of states. Fear could lock 1,000 doors. Yet looking back over the span of his life, Murphy knew the absolute truth that every ruthless king eventually had to learn. None of that external armor mattered when the dark came calling. The greatest wall in the world could not protect a man from his own coldness. It took something infinitely smaller, a 3-year-old child stepping out of the dark, a tiny hand offering a sticky candy, and a beast willing to drop his jaws for the simple grace of being told he didn't have to carry the world alone. That was the only force in the universe capable of opening the ultimate door. Later that evening, as the golden autumn sun dipped below the Atlantic horizon, painting the sky in vibrant strokes of amber and crimson, Bruno closed his eyes one last time on the sunny porch of the Newport estate, slipping away as quietly and peacefully as he had lived. They buried him beneath the ancient oak tree in the courtyard, right where the morning sunlight hit the grass first. No grand monuments were erected. No syndicate bosses were summoned to mourn. Just a stone marker, a little girl in a red dress, laying a single yellow butterscotch candy upon the fresh soil, and a powerful man standing beside her in silence, knowing that some bonds are forged deeper than blood and stronger than death itself. The wind carried the sound of the ocean toward the hills. The lights of the estate flickered on, warm and eternal against the gathering night. And inside the house, the doors remained open, welcoming all those who still believed in the quiet, unstoppable magic of a love that refused to let you die alone. Dear friends, the past can never be truly rewritten. The shadows that once lingered in the hallways of our deepest fears can never be completely erased. Yet genuine, fearless trust has a way of unlocking doors that even a lifetime of power and protection could never move. Sometimes, the universe does not just return what was taken from us in the dark. It gives us the miraculous chance to build a sanctuary where we never have to walk alone again. So we leave you with one final question today. Has a tiny, unexpected light ever walked into your life and completely rewritten your world? Please share your story with us in the comments below. If this journey of redemption and fierce devotion touched your wounded heart, tap the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single heartbeat of our next tale. Share this story with someone who reminds you of your own safe harbor, the one person who makes you put down your weapons and simply stay. May you always be surrounded by souls worthy of your beautiful, fragile heart. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we will meet again soon. Goodbye for now.